Welcome to the Policy Shop, weekly conversations with public policy experts where we'll dive into the most important issues affecting all of us here in Illinois. I'm Hillary Gowans. Let's get started.
We've been tracking small business performance for years, including during the pandemic. The truth is, small businesses are at the heart and soul of Illinois' economy. And in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, these businesses are the ones leading the recovery. Joining me with more on this is Bryce Hill, Director of Fiscal and Economic Research. Bryce, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I always love your Small Business Saturday analysis. I know that has come and gone, but tell me a little bit about what you were looking at and what your major findings were.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite pieces to get to work on every year, just because it's really nice when data actually aligns and supports a feel-good story. And so that's very rare in Illinois, but essentially, you mentioned we've been tracking this for years. Post Great Recession, small businesses with fewer than 20 employees have represented the bulk of jobs growth in the state. So in that time, small businesses have added more than 300,000 jobs. So 2010 to 2019, that was, basically 2/3 of job creation in the private sector came from small businesses. And then, this past year for Small Business Saturday, we really documented what happened during the onset of COVID and that downturn, and then what happened in the subsequent recovery. And we had some pretty interesting findings. COVID hit everybody hard. All kinds of people were laid off. State mandates came and shut down businesses, and we didn't know what the rules were going to be, how long these rules were going to be in place. Business owners were simply told, in many cases, that they just weren't allowed to operate. And so we saw massive job losses in the state. But they varied depending on who your employer was in terms of the size of your employer. Small businesses, like I said, businesses with fewer than 20 employees were laying people off at 1/3 of the rate of larger businesses. So their workforces only shrank by about 3%, whereas across every other category, that number was more like 9% in the layoffs across the board. So, I think that really speaks to the grind of being a small business owner and how vital staying open, retaining your employees, and continuing to provide goods and services to your customer is to the livelihood of the business. Is likely part of the reason why there was a much smaller layoffs happening for small businesses. And then in the recovery, they're the only businesses to actually have added jobs since the onset of COVID. So since the beginning of 2020, small businesses have actually grown payrolls by about 50,000. All other categories of businesses through the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we're still missing about 180,000 jobs. So small businesses were the least likely to lay people off. They've actually only been the only source of jobs growth in the state in the time since COVID. So, Small Business Saturday was a pretty good day to show some support to those guys.
It's kind of like a day of triumph for these people. I mean, you can't talk to someone without hearing their version of the same story, which is like, my favorite restaurant, the owner would be working from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. We would see them waiting tables, bussing tables. I mean, I would see that. They couldn't find enough workers. So do you think some of the bounce back is these people who did everything they could to stay open, working these crazy hours, being completely understaffed? Is some of this bounce back sort of like a natural return to what staffing should have looked like? Or what do you think is driving this?
So yeah, I'm sure there's some of that going on. Part of that's going to be the fact that there was less ground to make up because they laid off fewer employees in the first place. So you've got both of those things happening, and then larger businesses. We talk about help wanted signs going up all the time, and people being so understaffed. Large businesses seem to be almost more hesitant in some regards to resuming normal activities. You know, whether that could be, because there's just more leeway on a large business to say we're going to make these hiring and firing decisions, or hold off on having people return to the workforce or what have you. Um, but the day-to-day operations of a small business being, so kind of, you know, your your everything's happening in an instant. You need your employees because you need to be able to make payroll and you need to be able to pay rent. It's just a little bit different than a larger business. I think that some of those dynamics being different for small businesses are the reason why we're seeing that in these smaller businesses compared to larger businesses, which are a little bit slower to get back to where we were pre-pandemic.
And I know that for this analysis, you stripped out the government sector. You looked solely at private sector businesses. And before we started recording, you were sort of giving an interesting breakdown of what Illinois' economy actually looks like. What percentage of the population is employed by bigger businesses versus smaller businesses? What does that breakdown look like?
Yeah, so, all of this isn't to say that big business isn't important to the state or that we shouldn't care about large businesses, because we absolutely should. And we've seen quite the exodus of these large businesses from Illinois in recent years, and especially in the past few months. So about 53% of Illinois' private sector workforce is employed by a large business with 500 or more employees. So, that's almost 3 million Illinoisans. So a lot of the economy is tied up in these large businesses, and they play a major role. Whereas if you look at these small businesses with fewer than 20 employees, they employ roughly 800,000 Illinoisans, about 16% of the state's workforce. It's a much smaller number, but this is where the churn basically happens. This is where the growth happens. There's not a ton of new players coming to the table when it comes to 500 plus employee businesses. You know, there's, you know, there's ebbs and flows that kind of balance each other out at that large scale that keep things relatively flat. But there's a lot of movement happening on the fringes when it comes to small businesses, because there's more turnover in those businesses. There's more growth potential for these businesses that are just starting out that maybe want to one day get to be a bigger business. So virtually all of the bulk of the growth in employment comes from these small businesses, and it's a byproduct of just the nature of small businesses. In order to grow to be that size, you have to start out small, and just these other dynamics of lots of turnover in these businesses, and destruction and creative destruction in different industries, and new businesses coming in to fill unforeseen needs.
All right. So if the small business jobs story is a feel-good story, what policy changes do we need to embrace to have more of this feel-good story, more small business growth?
I think we need to really let small businesses do what they do best, which is hire people, which is put people to work and solve problems and meet needs that were previously not being met. Uh, and so I think largely that means getting government out of the way in many instances. So Illinois has the third most cumbersome regulatory code in the nation. There's over 260,000 individual pieces of regulation, and mandates created in state statute. So we need to, I think, take a deeper dive and look at what exactly those are and what purpose are they serving. Are we unduly inhibiting job creators by requiring hundreds of hours of certification or other educational requirements that are seemingly unnecessary or out of line with other states? That's a good place to start. The other things that we should be looking to do are avoiding unnecessary mistakes. So actually, just this past week, Governor Pritzker announced a deal to pay off finally the state's outstanding unemployment insurance trust fund deficit, which was taken as a loan from the federal government and would have carried tax penalties, seen a reduction in unemployment benefits for future people drawing on the system, and would have basically been a per per head payroll tax on employers that would have gone directly to the federal government, not even going to benefit state systems or state sources. Avoiding things like that are going to be critical. So it's good to see that happened, but we need to make sure that in the future, if we do hit a recession, especially with our unemployment trust fund still being so low, that we avoid that potential mistake. And then businesses, just like individuals, property taxes are a major concern. They're second highest in the nation in Illinois. They're often one of the largest fixed expenses, whether they come in the form of high rents because landlords pass those on to businesses, or for business owners who own their property. Those are going to be very large expenses. So working on property tax reform is going to be essential for the health and long-term growth of small business in the state as well.
All right. Well, Bryce, I know you're going to keep your eye on this, but thanks for the update for now. We'll talk again soon, okay?
Absolutely.
Listen and subscribe to The Policy Shop wherever you get your podcasts.